Now we're in North Warwickshire. What does their MP, the Conservative Dan Byles, make of it all? He joins me. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning.
What would be, in your view, the impact of HS2 in Warwickshire, North Warwickshire?
I'm firmly of the belief that North Warwickshire is probably the worst affected borough and constituency outside of London.
Right.
We have phase 1, we have phase 2, we have the Delta junction where it branches off into Birmingham, we have the Y junction. Every one of those junctions is effectively a spaghetti junction of high-speed rail line on top of high-speed rail line. It's has a very, very bad impact locally, and I'm delighted that we do actually have a pretty strong local political consensus that Labour, Conservative councillors, we fight alongside each other to try to improve the impact on local people and to try to stop high-speed rail altogether.
So I'll take it that although a Conservative MP, you are very much against HS2.
Oh, I'm very much against HS2. I voted against the paving bill and I'm pledged to vote against the high-speed rail hybrid bill when it comes to the House of Commons.
However, talking with some of your colleagues in the party earlier this week, and indeed the Transport Secretary, they have all given very strong arguments as to why HS2 should go ahead. There is the capacity argument, there is the economic argument, there is bringing the country, I suppose, more interconnected and bridging, as Nick Clegg says, the north-south divide. Do none of those arguments stand with you?
Well, unfortunately, you can't just make those arguments without making the case with evidence and actually putting forward a proper reasoned statement. The Transport Select Committee looked at this, and on the point of the north-south divide, which, by the way, came later in the arguments after the economic case started falling apart, the Transport Select Committee have said only time will tell if high-speed rail can help improve the north-south divide. Well, I'm not sure I want to spend £50 billion and see if only time will tell if it achieves one of its major aims.
One of the other major arguments, of course, is it starts to connect us, and it will eventually form a map of connectivity with Europe. I mean, this goes back to the mid-90s when Jacques Delors wanted us to connect up, back in 1993.
I'm not convinced the best way to sell to the British people that high-speed rail is a good idea is to quote Jacques Delors and connectivity with Europe. I think on its own that's a meaningless statement. What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? The business case has been consistently demolished. There's no actual real argument that suggests that we're going to be able to improve the economy through this. Evidence from other countries have actually shown that small regional economies like Birmingham and the West Midlands, when linked to a larger economy like London, can suffer what's called a negative agglomeration effect, which means instead of economic activity being pushed out from the centre, it can actually be sucked in towards the centre. If you're a company, you have an office in Birmingham, an office in London, and because of high you decide you only need one, which one are you going to close? You're not going to be closing the London office, you're going to be closing the Birmingham office. And the business case simply doesn't have any real robust economic analysis to demonstrate that this is going to be good for the West Midlands economy or the country's economy.
On that subject of the economy, much been said about it. There's no shortage of optimistic forecasts from the line's backers. It'll generate 22,000 construction jobs in the next 5 years, and once the entire line is running, create a further 100,000 jobs. And the KPMG report estimates that within 5 years of the line opening, UK productivity will rise by 15 billion a year.
Well, the KPMG report has been quite comprehensively trashed as being, they basically said, if you exclude all factors other than rail connectivity, is this a good idea? And then funnily enough, they decide, yes, it improves rail connectivity, therefore it's a good idea. But the fact of the matter is, how much is this costing? I'm just to remind, what's the current BBC figures for this?
50 billion.
Okay, do you think you could spend 50 billion on anything and not create some jobs, even by accident? If you piled 50 million up to burn it, you'd probably create thousands of jobs just with the bulldozer drivers alone. The opportunity cost of spending £50 billion on something is enormous. And the benefits we could give to our existing transport infrastructure, upgrading the West Coast Main Line, there are other alternative proposals to improve, for example, the capacity problem, which will cost a lot less. And one of my concerns is, what's the opportunity cost of this? Are we going to see any major transport projects in Cornwall and East Anglia and other parts of the country for years to come? We're probably going to see a lot less than we would have done because the money's all going to this.
Let's look at the West Coast Main Line argument, because Network Rail says that by the mid-2020s, the West Coast Main Line will be full. They're saying most of the crowding will be at the southern end of the line, and, for the most overcrowded services across the country are London Midland services.
But the Transport Select Committee were very critical of this type of argument, because this type of argument assumes that you don't do anything, and nobody's arguing that you leave the West Coast Main Line the way it is. There is an alternative proposal, I'm sure you're aware, called Rail Package 2, which looks at investing several £billion. It's not cheap, but it's it's cheaper than HS2 in longer trains, in clearing the pinch points, in improving the signalling, and improving and running more trains per hour on the existing tracks. And you can increase capacity quite considerably for a much, much lower figure. And again, the business case that was put forward was heavily criticised by the Oxera report commissioned by the Transport Select Committee for basically comparing HS2 to a counterfactual of doing nothing, which is highly disingenuous. In fact, it's dishonest.
Those are the broad picture arguments. More locally, what will be the effect of HS2 coming through your constituency? The
effect locally is terrible. I mean, it literally knocks down houses, takes out a primary school, takes out a rugby club, takes out a primary school in Water Orton. I mean, we don't know exactly what's happening yet, but it runs through the playing field, right next to the buildings. Using the criteria they used for HS1, the primary school should technically close and move somewhere else, because in HS1 they actually had a plan for schools. For HS2, although they're developing a plan for schools that are affected, we don't yet know what they're going to do with Water Orton Primary School. And Water Orton is one of those villages where the primary school is more than just a school. It's actually the hub of the village. It's where, if they have a fete, it takes place around the school. You know, it's one of those. It's a real community asset. It also takes out the rugby club. We're going to lose. There's a new scout hut up at Polesworth that's been planned for a long time.
Do you know how many houses you're going to lose in your constituency on land?
We don't yet know, because HS2 still won't tell us exactly which houses they know that they want. So they've safeguarded large areas of land for phase 1, which include houses, some of whom have now applied to have their houses bought by the government and have been turned down for having their houses bought by the government, even though they're in the area that HS2 Limited say they're going to need. So no, the answer is even HS2 Limited don't seem to know which houses they want. But, and this is a key point, they've blighted thousands of houses. And the problem with projects like HS2 is it has completely frozen the property market up and down the route. If you live somewhere like Middleton or somewhere like Gilson or parts of Water Orton, you cannot even get an estate agent to come out and market your property unless you pay them hundreds and hundreds of pounds up front as a non-refundable payment, because they know they don't have a hope in hell of actually selling your property.
And have you heard this from your constituents?
Oh, I deal with this all the time. I mean,
we're going to be talking with the National Association of Estate Agents later on in the programme.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I and members of my office have sat in dozens of houses and kitchens up and down the constituency, helping people fill in application forms for the exceptional hardship scheme, for example. I've spoken to numerous sort of village hall events, talking to villagers, and it's a real problem, because there is a scheme whereby if you can demonstrate exceptional hardship, HS2 Limited will buy your property. It's a very complex and difficult scheme. But if you can't demonstrate you've got an exceptional hardship, you could be stuck in the house for 10 years. And you might want to move, but unless you can demonstrate an exceptional hardship, tough, you can't sell your property.
Dan Byles, why are you at odds with your other fellow members of Parliament? Because we've spoken to many, and whilst many understand the issues and have great sympathy, and Caroline Spellman yesterday was talking about how she's fighting to get certain changes, Jeremy Wright saying he believes in principle of HS2, if I've got this right, but it's in the wrong place. Why are you so far out in your criticism of it?
I'm not alone. There are other MPs who are unhappy with this as well. And I find...
In your own party?
Well, what I find is interesting is actually this cuts across parties. You know, I stand alongside MPs like Geoffrey Robinson, Labour MP in Coventry, firmly opposing high-speed rail, and there are Conservative colleagues who are in favour, and there are Labour MPs who are in favour. Particularly the further north you go. What I find is this isn't so much a party issue, it's almost a geographical issue. The further north you go, the more evangelical MPs of all sides get, because I believe that they do believe it will improve the economy of the north. I don't think that case has been made, but I can understand that they believe it, and I can understand the gut feeling as to why they might. But the simple fact is that this shouldn't be a party political issue, and broadly speaking it isn't. As I said, I stand alongside Labour MPs who are opposed to it, and I fight against Labour and Conservative MPs who are in favour of it.
And you will continue to do so?
I will continue to do so, absolutely.
Dan Byles MP, thank you very much indeed.